Hello everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we're on top of a mountain in Virginia, speaking with Paula Whyman, the author of a new book, Bad Naturalist, One Woman's Ecological Education on a Wild Virginia Mountaintop. It is indeed rather wild, which explains some of the wind noises on the audio in this conversation. And to begin our keen-on conversation with Paula Whyman, I asked her to introduce herself.
I'm Paula Whyman. I'm an author. I was born in Washington, D.C. 59 years ago. In that time, I've been an editor for probably, 40 years of that plus. And I've been a writer for a lot more of that time. And this is my second book, Bad Naturalist. My first book was called You May See a Stranger. It was a short story collection. It came out about 8 years ago. And now I'm here on this mountain in Virginia where I'm hoping to restore the meadows to predominantly to encourage native plants, to support native wildlife, birds and pollinators and other insects, and foster the interconnections among these creatures.
Paula, you noted that you were born in Washington, D.C. Your new book, Bad Naturalist, One Woman's Ecological Education on a Wild Virginia Mountaintop. We happen to be on that wild Virginia mountaintop speaking right now. So most of your life has been spent in D.C., in one of the more urban centers. What's been your relationship over your life with nature? Is it something you've always romanticized, been in love with, been intimate with? How would you define your lifelong relationship with nature, with American nature in particular?
American nature. Well, ever since I was a kid, I've been very focused on wildlife and insects, especially insects. I was always turning over rocks looking for them. I would collect cicadas and let them crawl on my arms. And at one time I collected 100 cicadas in a bug house, and my parents told me the dog ate them when they weren't there the next day. I'm not sure if that's true.
I hope you forgave your parents.
Of course. And I would do things like at the beach, I would find a horseshoe crab on the beach, and I was sure it wasn't supposed to be washed up there, so I would throw it back in the water. And when it washed up on the beach again, I brought it to our motel room and put it in the bathtub with a little salt, hoping that would suffice. And I was always doing things like that. I was always very interested in animals also, and when you're a kid, the animals that you're most exposed to are farm animals. So for a long time, I was a huge fan of James Herriot's books, All Things Great and Small, all his memoirs. I read every single one, and I wanted nothing more than to be a large animal vet, preferably in the Yorkshire Dales. That obviously didn't happen, but I did become a junior farmer, and I took care of farm animals at a local park for a while. But eventually I figured out that being a veterinarian meant dealing with a lot of death, and I wasn't so interested in that. And I eventually learned the difference between farm animals and wildlife, and I actually still want to have sheep. I still want to raise farm animals, but primarily I'm most interested in wildlife and what I see around me. Even here, I'm excited when I see an insect that I can't identify, and I immediately try to figure it out. I tend to do deep dives into various creatures or places. Like for a while I was really interested in mangrove swamps, and I did a lot of research on mangroves. Recently I became obsessed with carpenter bees, and I wrote an essay about carpenter bees. So this mountain was a place that the first time I saw it, it was a place that I knew was going to become my next deep dive.
Well, we're going to get to the mountain
Yeah.
in a minute. We'll climb that mountain for you in a second. But I wonder, I don't want to get myself into trouble here, but do you think it's more likely that girls, young women, sort of fetishize, fall in love with nature in the way you did, wanting to become James Herriot, of course, who was male, or probably still is, I'm not sure if he's still around, still is male. Was there a female quality to it, a romantic quality? Your prince was American nature?
I don't know about that. When I was a kid, I was very much, all of my friends were boys, because boys, at least at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, the boys I knew wanted to do the things that I wanted to do. They wanted to play outside in the dirt and run around and climb fences. And the girls I knew wanted to play house. So I'm not sure if that is, I don't know. I think that is a bit of a stereotype.
Well, I apologize.
No, it's also true that I think until really recent years, a lot of conservation biologists, people in the ecology fields, they were fields dominated by men, and now that's changing. That's been changing. So I don't know. Maybe if you were talking about horses, little girls and horses, maybe.
Well, let me rephrase the question, or rethink the question, Paula. We're on the mountaintop now. You're involved in your regeneration project. We're going to talk about that. That's the subject of your book. But for much of your life, nature was theory. Now it's practice. Do you think your imagination of nature, what you thought it was when you were growing up, and perhaps as a young woman before you got to this mountaintop, was it all fantasy, or was there some reality?
No, I mean, I don't know. I used to play with bugs, so I would hold a praying mantis in my hand and put a spider on my hand with it and see what happened. And so I'm not sure, that doesn't sound so much like fantasy, but I will say that what I'm trying to do here now is not at all what I expected to be doing, and it is something that when I started, I had no idea what I was doing. So that part of it was very idealistic, that to think that I could do this project, that I could bring back, encourage native plants to predominate in this meadow, when I knew almost nothing about plants. My focus had always been on insects and wildlife, mostly, and I was terrible at growing plants. So what made me think I could do that? That part of it was sort of romantic and idealized, for sure. So,
Paula, we did a show a few months ago with Mimi Castile, who's a regenerative wine farmer, wine grower, winemaker out in Oregon. We went out to visit her. She talked about her lifelong love of the American land and the American landscape. We're on the other coast now, 2,000 or 3,000 miles away from Mimi, but it's a similar beauty of mountains, of trees. We're here in November. This will go out in January, but a particularly beautiful time. Do you feel a degree of responsibility for looking after the beauty of America, the land, which is, of course, the core of this country?
well, absolutely. I'll tell you a statistic that really struck me when I first heard it. 85% of grasslands and more than 50% of forests are privately owned. So that means that people tend to think that nature is in parks. It's in national parks, it's in state parks, local parks, and those are the places where we're going to preserve nature. But that statistic tells you that that can't be true, that no matter what size, you don't have to own huge acreage to even think about the fact that anybody who owns any piece of land should, I think, have a sense of responsibility responsibility about taking care of it, because we can't just rely on parks to quote-unquote save natural places, which is another good reason not to make this into a 200-acre cattle farm. Nothing wrong with cattle farms, and you can absolutely have cattle farms that are conservation friendly. And this was a cattle farm for quite some time. But now it's not, and it hasn't been for a long time, and I'd like to keep it this way. Keep it a place for native wildlife and plants that evolved together, that are naturally meant to be together, meant to form a system. And yeah.
We also did a show up the road with a regenerative farm. I know you've got a regenerative farm down the road. You're not a farmer. This is a 200-acre piece of land, but you're not primarily a farmer. But is the spirit of what you're trying to do here, in a sense, regenerative, even if you're not a formal regenerative farmer?
I suppose you could use that word to describe it. Usually it's described as ecological restoration. In the UK, more often they call it rewilding. Although rewilding, I think, is a little bit different, because it also implies bringing animals back that will replace animals that no longer live there, that were wild. So what I'm doing here is technically ecological restoration, although restore is probably not the right word for it, because you can't bring back something. It's impossible to go backwards. You can only go forwards. And what you can do is really dependent on what's here, what's already here, and what was done by other people before. You only have to work with what you have. So it's not really restoring. And when you say regenerative, I think about the soil when you talk about regenerative agriculture. And from what I understand, a lot of it is about, rather than negative inputs, rather than adding pesticides and fertilizer and so on, to bring back the soil to its natural state, or to a natural state, and make it healthier with organisms and so on. And if you have predominantly native plants, that will happen. If you're not, I'm not fertilizing, I'm not, for the most part, spraying. So whatever grows here naturally, and the soil is appropriate for those plants. So the soil that's appropriate for native plants is not the same soil that's appropriate for pasture land.
Yeah, we've done shows in the past with Isabella Tree, who's one of the pioneers of rewilding. Is this a movement? I mean, in a sense, Paula, in parallel with regenerative farming, the rewilding movement?
I suppose so, and I want to say that Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, was one of my inspirations. I had read it just a few months before I first saw this place. So it was in my mind, her project of having restored, over 3,500 acres. But again, not really restored, but allowing it to sort of do what it wanted to do, and bringing back animals and so on. So what I'm doing here is a little bit different. Is it a movement? I would say I'm hearing more and more about landowners wanting to do this. Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park movement is very big in this country, and that's another project that really inspired me. Doug's book, Nature's Best Hope, which is all about how to bring native plants back to your backyard if you live in the suburbs and you have a lawn, how to improve the balance between lawn and native plants to attract pollinators, to allow birds to breed, and restore nature, in a sense, to this large swath of green that is the suburbs. So both of those books, Wilding and Nature's Best Hope, and both of those authors really inspired me in this project. And I would say that in this country, Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park has spurred a movement. As there were people who were already doing this kind of thing, but people didn't realize they could do it anywhere they happened to be until I think he started talking about it. And that's one thing that I really hope to inspire people to do. I hope that people take hope away from my book and start paying attention to nature where they are, because you don't have to have 200 acres to think about it. I mean, I've lived in the city, I've lived in the suburbs, and there's nature everywhere. You're part of it. Humans are nature. So even if you're in the city, there's a plant growing in the crack of the sidewalk. There are birds. There are ways to pay attention, and when you pay attention, I think you get more interested. At least that's what happens to me. I start focusing on something more when I pay attention to it, and that inspires me and spurs me to action. And I think if all you do is, you find a weed in your backyard and you pull it, it's invasive, and you pull it, and you see something else grow there, I think that's sort of empowering. You're making change on a very small scale, and it matters.
So is there a political quality to this? Not conventional politics, not two-party politics, but are you, in a sense, part of a movement trying to change America in your own way?
I don't know about that. I really just want to make sure that I feel a responsibility to make this mountain a place that native wildlife can live. I want more native ground nesting birds that are in decline to be able to live here, and the only way I can do that is to shift the balance toward native plants. There's a huge, massive decline in native grassland birds, and birds like the bobwhite quail, which traditionally would have lived in a place like this, but they can't live here because when you have too much dense grasses, they can't navigate. They're tiny little birds. So if you have native plants, then the birds can navigate. I'm sort of getting I don't know where I'm going with this, but what was your question?
Well, the question was about the politics. So perhaps to backtrack, Paula, why have things got out of sync? Is it global warming? Is it industrial farming? Is it just people who previously had owned the land had shown less interest in native insects and fauna? What's the why has this happened?
Well, wherever we go, we disturb things. We develop and build. Part of it might be industrial farming, but it's any kind of building a subdivision, building an office park, building a road, building a bridge, building a dam. Anytime you disturb land, you're creating an opportunity for plants to come in that don't that don't support local systems. And I'm talking about invasive plants now. And a large part of what I do here, probably more than half of what I do, is managing invasive plants so that they don't take over. And managing invasive plants so that I'm trying to remove them to make more room for native plants because they push them out. So humans have moved all over the planet, which is totally normal. And when they've done that, they've brought plants with them. Our shipping, we have unintentionally brought plants and insects the emerald ash borer that's killing all the ash trees here, the spotted lanternfly that's killing everything, plants like the tree of heaven. They were either planted intentionally, often with good intentions, like kudzu in the south was planted to restore the soil in the south after cotton depleted the soil, and obviously it took over and became a huge problem. So we've made a lot of mistakes. And what's happened with the land now, sure, part of it is climate change, but a lot of it is our own mistakes and just not knowing any better for so long, unintentionally causing these problems. And then even when we know better, continuing to cause us problems. But I think there is a movement now, or people are starting to understand, and more people are getting involved, and every act, every small act helps and makes a difference.
Paula, we're on your mountaintop now. You're in a sense, you're suggesting you're putting nature back together again, maybe not formal restoration, but rewilding, as you said. Cast your mind back. We're an hour east of Washington, D.C., in Virginia, one of the places that the colonialists, the European colonialists, at least settled 300-400 years ago. Mm-hmm. What was this land like back then?
Well,
can you imagine? Well, it seems pretty, and I'm a city person, so for me, trees just look natural. It seems pretty natural to me as I look out. But if we were here 300 or 400 years ago, how different would it be?
That's a great question, and I was wondering the same thing. The apple orchards came into this area in the 1830s, and this whole mountaintop, including many of the forested areas, were planted in apple trees in the 1830s. Before that, part of the mountain would have been forested, and part of it would have been open meadow or savanna. I had a scientist out here who specializes in grasslands, and he looked around and told me that he thought it was very likely that a large part of the open meadow, which right now there are about 75 acres of open meadow, which on top of a mountain is fairly unusual. But he thought a lot of it had probably been like that for much, much longer because of the way the rock outcroppings were, just the way the landscape. It would have been maintained naturally by lightning fires at that point. So that's another reason I'm set on trying to keep the open meadow open. A lot of people assume that closed canopy forest is the natural progression, but that's not true everywhere. And a large part of the American South was originally grasslands. You can see in journals written by explorers in the early 1600s talking about the grass being over their heads or taller than their horses' withers. That's how it used to be until we came in and farmed everything, developed.
You're I don't know how you call it, a rewilder, a natural nativist in a sense. What about
naturalist?
Naturalist,
but a bad naturalist.
Well, the title of your book is Bad Naturalist, but you're actually, certainly compared to most of us, you're a good naturalist. What about the indigenous peoples? I mean, no one's ever indigenous. In the beginning of time, no one was here. But there were people before the Europeans showed up. Was there a strong indigenous community in Virginia, in this mountainous neighborhood?
Andrew, I would love to know that. There is some research that indicates that there was an indigenous presence in the county, like along the rivers, especially. As far as early on, though, thousands of years ago, for sure, I think people came down from the Ohio Valley to Virginia. But as for this mountain specifically, I've tried to find out and haven't been able to find out. A lot of times, you don't see studies being done on private land, and this has been private land for so long. And I'm just hoping that more information will come out eventually, and through oral storytelling and histories, we'll get more information on that, because I would love to know. I don't really know the answer, and there hasn't been a lot of research yet in this county.
We've done a lot of shows on indigenous culture, indigenous peoples, some specifically on their relationship with the land in contrast with the European settlers, colonialists, call them what you want. Do you think that in some ways the indigenous peoples of North America had a healthier attitude towards the land, in a sense, as a rewilder? Are you going back to their ideas, or are you doing something different?
Oh, I think there is a big trend to finally pay attention to the ideas, especially through methods like prescribed burns. Native people did a lot of burning for various reasons, and I think some of those reasons are known and some aren't known. But we've done prescribed burns on this property to encourage native plants, and so that's one thing I can speak to. Otherwise, I'm not really sure I know the answer to that. I do think that the whole trend toward paying more attention to what's around you has a basis in what I understand about native attitudes toward the land, and extracting less.
The extraction issue, of course, touches on capitalism. We did a show a couple of years ago with an Oxford philosopher who wrote a book called How to Be a Good Ancestor. A lot of the thinking about indigenous people, especially of North America, is they had a more ancestral approach perhaps to the land. They saw it, maybe not in formal terms, they certainly didn't write books about it, but they saw it as something that they inherited and passed on. Do you think there's any truth to that, in terms of understanding perhaps why the native peoples had a better attitude, a more constructive attitude, a more responsible attitude towards the land?
Well, I think when you live on the land and you rely on it in every way, it seems rational. It seems completely logical to look at it that way, because if you ruin it for yourself, you're not going to be able to live on it. Now, I mean, there are probably examples of, we're all human. I'm sure there are examples where that attitude wasn't applied and didn't work out so well, but the good examples we have are, I think, logically, if you're living in the wild and you are part of it, you have to take care of it, or it won't take care of you.
Lots of critics of the American project, if that's the right word, Paula, suggest that it was flawed from the beginning because of its fetishization of private property. Locke, of course, and Lockean principles of the foundation have suggested that we create ourselves through land, through ownership. You touched on that a little earlier. Your new book isn't political, you're not necessarily a political thinker. But do you think there is, one of the reasons why this has gone so wrong is because of private property and the way in which people use land to extract, you use that word, extract, a surplus, to make profit, setting up apple orchards or any other means to make money out of the land?
Well, apple orchards were a way to live, and they were also a way to claim land in the West. You had to plant, I hopefully will get this right, you had to plant a certain number of acres of trees in order to claim land under, I think it was the Homestead Act back in the day. And that land, of course, didn't belong to those people to begin with who were claiming it. That's a side issue.
Who did it belong to?
Well, at the time, the native people were living there.
But they had no formal sense of ownership, so it was different ways.
I suppose, yeah.
Tragically different.
Yeah. I just lost track of the question.
About land and ownership, and whether
yes.
for people, some people on the left, that the whole American enterprise, particularly in terms of nature, was flawed right from the beginning because of the way in which the land was turned into private property, and then the principle of extraction became the core issue, and therefore, and I'm simplifying their argument, of course, the nature became exploited.
Well, I'll say this, that I never imagined myself owning land. That was not a thing that I ever aspired to. It was not even on my radar. I came from a family of small business people, and the goal was always to be able to support yourself and not to have to rely on anyone. So in that sense, my family, I don't come from a family of farmers, but the whole self-reliance attitude was there, and we had that in common. But as far as owning land, I don't know, it seems like a very strange concept to me. I own this land, but do I own the beetles? Do I own the lichens? Do I own the rocks? I guess I do, but who said? No, it's a piece of paper says that, but it's a very weird concept to me. I just never, I don't get it in a lot of ways. That because the land is, I don't know. I'm not. I guess politically, I don't know how I feel about what you asked. But it is a very strange concept to think that this thing that is attached to the planet is something that I own. That it's just weird. I don't know. Like, do I own that tree over there? I guess so. It's just very
Well, you
strange.
own that tree in the sense that you have the right, I guess, to cut it down if you choose to. If you don't like the tree, or because the tree gets in the way of the view of the distant mountain, or if in your view the tree needs to be cut down because it's sick. That's what ownership means.
Yes. Well, but that's why I see it as a responsibility.
Yeah,
So,
you're a good ancestor.
Well, thank you.
You're a wannabe good ancestor.
I hope so. I think, did you lose your,
Yeah, don't mind. Go on.
I'm trying, I'm doing the best I can. It's because land ownership is the system we have. Within that system, I think if you do own land, or at least I take the responsibility very seriously, and I may have jumped into this project precipitously and idealistically, but I also see it as something that's going to be my focus for the rest of my life, however long that is. And I'm going to have fun with it, and I take it seriously.
There's a certain irony here, Paula, again, you don't need me to tell you. The original settlers seized the land. They needed to make a profit from it in order to feed themselves, clothe themselves, empower themselves. The circle has been completed in an odd way, because now people like yourself, Isabella Tree, people who have resources from somewhere else are buying up the land to restore it. Is that a good or a bad thing, do you think?
Well, it depends. I think ideally, the people who are already in that place, it would be great if they were the people who had the land and were restoring it rather than people, zooming in from Washington, D.C. and it's not that far off. So it's complicated. Like, should I go to, you're from San Francisco, should I go out to Northern California here and buy up a bunch of land and be an absent owner and restore it? I don't know. All I know is someone is doing it, and it's good that someone is doing it. But I hope that at the same time, it benefits people locally. I think that's important, that restoring this place means that this mountaintop will remain like this, or maybe not like this, hopefully better than this, at least for my lifetime. And I hope that means that, well, nobody's going to come up here and build a tower. Nobody's going to subdivide this land. Well, this is under a conservation easement, so nothing else can be done here. And actually, the previous owner did that. And I think that makes this land a better place for everybody around. I mean, the people who live here are very concerned with maintaining the view sheds, not having, not ruining the landscape. We all agree on that, even if we don't agree on, politics or other things.
Maybe one. I mean, some people are optimistic that the environment and the land can actually be one of the things that the two Americas can agree on. It's one of the few things. We're near DC. I was in DC yesterday, and of course I walked up the Mall. On either side are great museums. In an odd way, what you're trying to do on your mountaintop in Virginia, are you trying to transform the American land into a kind of living museum?
That's an interesting question. A museums are static.
Well, I meant a living museum. The really good museums are. There are lots of innovators in the museum business who are trying to transform traditional museums into something that are alive.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. I still think of a living museum as something that is holding on to the past. And maybe this is, I don't know if I'd call it a museum, because it's not going to hold a bunch of plants that were here in the past. It's going to contain plants from the past, present, and future. And same with wildlife and birds and so on. So, I don't know, could we call it a living gallery?
Perhaps. Final question. It's a nice compromise, Paula. America, as you know, is going to be 250 years, celebrating its 250th anniversary in 2026, next year as it happens. A lot of pessimism in this country, but you'll probably be up here in July of 2026. Is this, and what you're doing and what some of the other rewilders in the US are doing, is this a reason to celebrate America and to be hopeful of its future?
I have hope. I think there's always reason to be hopeful, and I think that when I pull up a patch of weeds and I see something grow there that's good, when I hear the call of a bobwhite quail on the hillside, or when I see a kestrel flying over the field, those are reasons for hope.
Well, Paula Whyman, author of Bad Naturalist, One Woman's Ecological Education on a Wild Virginia Mountaintop. Maybe you're a second reason for hope. Thank you so much for appearing on Kino, and we'll have to come back. Lovely place, amazing place. You probably don't want everyone coming here. I'll use it as an excuse to come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I step on the sea?